many Central American immigrants, the decision to leave their homes is a response to high levels of violence, income inequality, and corruption. But the decision to leave is not without risk. Some nonprofits, like Catholic Relief Services, are working to educate and inform potential immigrants about those risks and some of the alternative options. I talked about this with Rick Jones. He's a youth and migration advisor in El Salvador for Catholic Relief Services. So in 2016, there were more than 17,000 Salvadoran children traveling without guardians who were apprehended along the U.S.-Mexico border. As far as you can tell, are Salvadorans aware of the immigration policy changes here in the States? And have the numbers either gone down or gone up at all in response to that in recent years?
Really, the decision to migrate or not doesn't depend so much on U.S. policy and what happens at the border. It depends really on what's happening here in the country. And the levels of violence have not abated. And so people are really leaving because of what's happening here, not what's happening in the United States.
Which is an important point to point out, that they're not necessarily seeing the headlines dominating U.S. news coverage. They're just looking at the reality around them and making the decision to go.
That's right. A lot of people are aware. They're aware of the risks along the migration route, about what's happening at the border, but they're desperate to protect their children or send their children north because anything is better than waiting to be killed here in El Salvador. And before people decide to immigrate, they try to exhaust all of their options here. They often move when they're forced by violence to immigrate. They go live with another family member, move to another city. But the gangs have the capacity to find people wherever they are. They have national networks that really have the ability to identify and find people, and they will continue to pursue people who they're looking for. So at the end of that chain, people just get desperate and say, I've exhausted all of my options here in El Salvador, and the only option I have is to leave. And I think that's important for us to understand around immigration, is that migrating is not the first option. It's the last option when people have exhausted all of their opportunities here at home and really feel like they have no other choice.
When I spent some time in Guatemala last year talking to people who are either making the trip or have stayed back and are worried about family who are trying to head north, got a sense there that word on the street is if you go with a young child, you have a better chance of getting into the United States. Is that similarly the belief in El Salvador?
I think there's an influence by the smuggling network providing direct information to families, saying that go now or don't go now. And they have a huge incentive. They're making a profit off of this situation. And this is a billion-dollar industry. Really, smuggling people is the second most lucrative thing to the drug trade. So there is a perverse incentive for smugglers to try and incentivize people to go.
And what, if anything, is the government of El Salvador doing to address the illegal smuggling network and frankly, to compel people to stay put?
Well, I think the Salvadoran government has been attempting several things. One, similar to what we do, are broad communications campaigns and media campaigns to explain to people what the risks are. It's in the media of what the U.S. policy is. They're also trying to drive down the violence levels, and they actually have in the last few years. In 2015, the homicide rate was actually 105 for every 100,000 people, and that's come down to 60. So it's actually improved, but it's still at the rates of epidemic. And so people are still being driven to leave because of that. So the Salvadoran government is actually making progress around violence and around these issues, but it's just not enough for people to really feel safe in a lot of the places throughout the country.
So let's dive a little bit into that gang culture, which is part of what's compelling people to leave the country. You've been a witness to this, and you've had some experience with it yourself. Talk to us about it.
The gang culture really has spread across the country, and the efforts to combat that have really failed in the sense of, while it has come down a little bit in the last couple of years, there are very few alternatives once somebody is a gang member. We know that it's possible to leave the gang, but there are very few alternatives or bridges to get out of the gang. And so they start recruiting young people as early as 7, 8, and 9 years old. And they start asking them to run errands and do favors. For example, go to the corner store and buy me a Coke. And then the gang member will get the child to go do that and then say, keep the change, buy yourself a piece of candy. And little by little, these children are being socialized and developing relationships to gang leaders in their community. And before they know it, they're being asked to be lookouts for the police, to look out for rival gang members, to carry drugs from one community to the next. And the risks of saying no once you get to that level are very high. I know one case where a young boy whose family sold bread and he had his bicycle and rode around selling the bread to different neighborhoods. The gangs asked him to take the drugs on his bicycle as a 12-year-old. And when he refused to do that, he was killed.
So what kind of resources can be provided to make sure that these children don't fall into one of these gangs, besides possibly just incredibly active parenting or family members making sure that young children don't run into people like this?
So there are several things. One is that you're absolutely right, strengthening families and parenting is a critical piece to this. We know for a fact that most of the young people who actually get in gang involved or become gang involved were actually victims in their house or suffered some type of abuse in the family, which is one of the primary factors of why young people get engaged in gangs to begin with. So addressing domestic violence, gender-based violence, and helping families be able to make a living, put food on the table, keep their kids in school is critical to combating gang violence.
So one of the ways I think the U.S. obviously has responded to this through the years is by pumping hundreds of millions of dollars in aid into El Salvador. But in the last few years, of course, that number has been reduced. Do you have any sense of what would happen if the United States stopped sending all of its aid, as it does right now, to El Salvador?
You know, I think we would move from thousands of people in the recent caravan to tens of thousands of people if they cut off all the foreign aid. The other thing to consider is that also if they end the temporary protected status for Salvadorans living in the United States send back to El Salvador almost $5 billion a year. That's 20% of the gross national product, and that's really what's keeping the country afloat. And so if the United States cuts off foreign aid and sends people back, people here will have no other alternative but to leave.
Pretty stark situation. Of course, temporary protective status granted to hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans over the last few decades, and it's one of the things the administration is thinking of revoking as part of its immigration policy. Rick Jones, Youth Migration Advisor for Catholic Relief Services, joining us from San Salvador. Thank you for doing so. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much.